So I don't know if the post-lunch slot is like the best spot because everyone's like revitalized and ready to go, or if everyone's going to be like sleeping through this. So I'll try and keep it like really exciting. Thanks. Yeah, no pressure. So just kind of, just to kind of get a feel for the room, is anyone currently using Flexbox? Okay. Ooh, so many. Okay, cool. What about CSS Grid? Okay, a lot less, which is great. And has anyone never tried any of these or used any of them? Don't be afraid. Thanks, Kenson. Awesome. So this talk's for all of the people that raised their hand. So kind of going to give a high-level review of what these are and kind of best ways to use them and give some examples. And also, yeah, just get you guys really excited to leave this talk wanting to go out and try it if you're one of the few people that haven't yet. Cool. So I think really covered all of my intro slide in that intro, so that's really good. But yes, I am from New York. I love coming to Oklahoma, though. My office is here, actually headquartered. So this was really fun. It's my first ThunderPlains conference, so it's great to be here. So I do work at Tailwind, and I do product design. My background's always been in design, and I think that's kind of why I've really fallen in love with a lot of CSS, because it is a very visual language. And you've really been able to see it evolve a lot over the years and kind of allow you to be a lot more creative on the design side and using CSS to make that happen. And I'm a part of an organization called Go Develop It, like you said, so I teach a lot of CSS classes and really just try and get everyone pumped up about CSS. It's just a really underrepresented language sometimes. Cool, so shameless plug. I do work at Tailwind. This is my crazy team. A few of them are here today, actually. It's headquartered in OKC. We are hiring all the time, so if you're interested in learning how we make world-class marketing easy for everyone, come see me later or stop by our table. We're right across the hallway there. Okay, so CSS. I think that what I really want to kind of start with is talking about CSS layout modes, and these may seem really familiar, but it's kind of surprising to kind of learn the different reasons they were brought about and why we actually sometimes are using them in the wrong ways, and kind of paints the picture for why we need Flexbox and CSS and why they're so important with the way modern web design is going and where it's heading. And so you're probably familiar with the 4 official layout modes that were built into CSS originally. So I'm just going to do a quick overview to kind of run through these. So display block is kind of like our standard default. So many HTML tags just come default as display block. And you have 3 divs on a page. They're going to stack like blocks, essentially. And so this is great, and this is kind of how we set up a standard flow in the DOM. And then we have kind of the opposite is the inline block, so you can have your elements flow horizontally and have them line up side by side. And this is just kind of like the other version of that. And so if you want to apply the different layout modes to an element that is, say, a block element, you want to make an inline block, you have to apply those properties directly to that element. And so that can be kind of limiting in a lot of ways if you're having to do that across the page to make things line up a certain way. And then the third layout mode is our positioning. So this has to do with breaking things out of the normal flow of the DOM. And so you have these elements that you can now place relatively towards other elements on the page or even to the page itself. And so that actually gave us a lot of flexibility to be able to, take elements and place them somewhere where they're never going to move. So for example, if you have a modal and you know that X close button's always going to be 10 pixels to the right and 10 pixels from the top, that's a really great use case for positioning and how we can use that to build pages and applications. And so the thing that positioning kind of lacks in some sense is being able to be really great responsively. So when you have these different elements that you're positioning absolutely across the page, when the browser's shifting, it's often unexpected results. And so being able to kind of break the normal flow of display block and display inline block is really nice, but there's a little less control here because you're kind of tied into some limitations. And then the final official layout mode is table. And so tables were just really, the only reason you should be using the table is to display like data on a table on a web page. And so I think this is a really great example of if you've ever worked on full web pages that were table layouts. So it's kind of a nightmare. And I think that this is a really good example of some of the things that we're missing from CSS that developers kind of, with their really, smart problem-solving skills, were able to come up with this layout mode that could work for creating a grid, which is what we, a lot of pages are made up that way. So it made it really easy to do. However, it's not what it was intended for, and trying to make like a responsive table work for what you want it to do is, really kind of impossible. And luckily, we don't really run into a lot of table-based layouts anymore for full pages. But yeah, this is kind of, one of those workarounds that just evolved with the needs of having to create these like modern web pages. Okay, so I didn't mention floats at all in this list, and it's very intentional. Floats were never meant to be a layout mode. The only reason floats were really invented, this property, was to wrap text around an image, and that's it. And I think floats have really kind of taken off and become this like, wow, we can now float all of the elements and they wrap so nicely, and then like it's really great. And then it's like you think about like clearing floats and like, what is that? Like, I think that was the hardest concept that like ever happened when I was learning code, is like, why do you have to clear this? Like, shouldn't this just work? And so I think that floats are another example of kind of like a workaround, like a hacky workaround for giving us the flexibility that we really wanted to design really great and responsive pages for the web. So that's kind of like where we were currently for a few years ago. And in the last couple years, these two new layout modes have kind of evolved. I remember, I was speaking, one of my first conferences was like 3 or 4 years ago, and I was speaking about Flexbox, and it was still kind of like new and exciting. But I think, now it's kind of matured, and it's become kind of, a lot of hand raises here for people having used it. But now we're like, oh, and now there's this thing called Grid too. And so I think that there's a lot of kind of figuring out, like, was Grid replacing Flexbox? Like, what is really happening here? And I don't think that Flexbox or CSS Grid are meant to replace really any of these. I think what they're actually doing is giving us a chance to use these layout modes as they were originally intended. So tables can be tables, floats can just float text, and we can save all the dynamic and responsive design and let Flexbox and CSS Grid handle that. So I'm going to kind of break down these two, show some examples, and kind of go from there. So Flexbox, it was like one of my favorite things that ever happened in CSS back in the day. I got really excited when this came out, just because I've been working with floats so much, and it was just a nightmare for me. So Flexbox is really great for taking elements and being able to position them across a single axis. And so what that means is you can work with rows or you can work with columns. And it wraps the content really nicely and gives you kind of the flexibility to have these elements kind of take up more space, shrink down. It's really just like a powerful tool. And so what that looks like, so I think with both Flexbox and CSS Grid, there's a lot of new terminology, which sometimes I feel like is a barrier to entry for some of these. It's like, I don't want to learn all these new properties. But they really are, once you kind of get to use them, they become more familiar, and you can kind of see why they're useful. And there's also a lot of like shorthand, so you don't have to write it out all the time. So for this, though, with Grid and Flexbox, you're taking a lot of the styles and putting them into the parent container. And I think that's a big shift from just having like a display block or display inline block on a single element. And so having this container is really powerful, because now any item that comes into it is automatically becoming a Flex item and inheriting any of the styles that were put on the container, which is the Flex container. And so with Flexbox, we have this container is kind of the wrapper. So you might have like a div with some paragraphs inside of it or something like that. And so it gives you kind of control with the two different axes. So you have a main axis and a cross axis. And so depending if it's in a row or a column layout, those will swap, which is something you kind of have to wrap your head around a little bit. But having that there is really great because if you don't know how many items are going to be in a certain container, you can set kind of the rules at the parent level, and then you have dynamic content. You have another blog post that gets added. You have something else. Like everything's just going to follow suit really nicely. And so this is kind of one way to kind of break this down a bit is like we have a bunch of properties that only work on the container, and we have a bunch of properties that only work on the flex items. And so with the container level, you can really you can define the direction that the elements are going to move in. You can define how the content's actually going to wrap. And you can also deal with the flow as kind of like the shorthand version. But with justify content and align items, that's how you're going to distribute those elements across the axes. So one's for the main one and one's for the cross axes. And so it's really great to be able to do all that at the parent level, and then sometimes you don't even have to add anything to the flex items, which is like crazy. It all just kind of like works like magic. And the flex item properties are really just kind of to override the properties set at the parent level, so you can kind of have one of your items, go rogue and go off axes. And then also the flex properties, which we'll get into a second. But so I wanted to kind of talk about the kind of like the highlights for me about when it's a really good use case for using Flexbox and kind of like my favorite parts of it. So this is kind of the highlight reel for Flexbox. There's a ton you can do with this, but this is just some of the examples. So really when you want to use Flexbox is when you want to control elements along a row or along a column. So it's really like a single axis use case for that. And what that looks like, this beautiful nav. I know I'm a designer, but this is really just to kind of highlight the containers for us. So you have this display flex on the parent, and the parent is going to be this gray, kind of greenish on this screen. But the main box is kind of the parent level. And so this is the only CSS that's being used for this. So on the actual flex items, which are all the menu items, there's a colored box as a background, the CSS, but there's actually no sort of width, there's no margin, there's no height. This is all being controlled at the parent level. And so I think that's like a really cool and interesting way to now be able to lay out our elements on the web. And so all this is saying is we have our display flex, which automatically defaults to a lot of things. So when in doubt, just add display flex and see what happens. But you have the flex direction is row, so you can kind of set that at a high level and know, okay, so we have this row of items that we want to do. And then the justify content is that the main axis, you're going to say, where do I want these elements to go along that? And so there's a bunch of different ones. You can do centered, you can do space between, space around. And space between is one of my favorites because it takes the first and the last element, pushes them all the way to the edge, and then everything else in between is just like, we're just going to evenly space this out for you. Don't worry about it. And so it's really great because, like I said, there's no width set on any of these new items. So you're really relying on the content to set its own width. So if you have these items and you don't necessarily know what the words will be in them, or you don't know how long the headlines will be and things like that, you can still know that the spacing is going to work, and it'll just kind of evenly put that space in for you. And so to kind of look at the other way you can use this, right? So this is the same exact code as before, but now the only thing that's changed is the flex direction is now a column. And so, right, you can see like nothing from here to here is just like one line of code. And it's really great, like if you're doing some sort of like mobile responsive navigation, this is like a perfect example of how you can use that with like a media query and just add column as like the change. And then it really just does this for you. And so the justify content is still spaced between, because that's just going to be, there's no extra space, so it's all just kind of together. If you were to make the height of this bigger, then you'd start to see some spacing. And then also with the align stretch, it's now going to give you that full width. And align item stretch is actually the default, so I just kind of added this for this this visual, but that gives you like a really nice menu, and it's with one line of code to change that. So it's really great for how you're going to work on a single axis, and you can switch that, and it just becomes really easy to work with. Cool. So another really interesting thing that Flexbox does that the other layout modes don't really do, Grid actually does, but the other before layout modes don't do, is you can change the source order of elements just through CSS. And so this is a really interesting thing that, as a web designer, I've come into this a lot, where sometimes you want to have this sort of card layout or something where you have text on the top and an image on the bottom, but then for maybe a different breakpoint, you want to switch those. And so there's different ways to do that. You could have like a different class. It's like your mobile-only class where you have the HTML is then switched around. You could have different like JavaScript ways to work around this. But I think this just makes it really easy, is you can just change the order with CSS. And so the way this is working is every element, it automatically starts at 1. And then the order property just takes an integer. It can be positive or negative. So if I were to put this at 2, it would go forward. If I put a -1, it goes back, because everything's kind of set at 1. And so it's really interesting that you can kind of change things. You can kind of do like a staggered layout where you might have a paragraph and an image, but then you want the image to be on top or over. And it was really hard to do before when your HTML was kind of set and you couldn't move it. And so this is kind of like a cool thing that Flexbox has let you do now. So distributing space among elements automatically. So this is kind of where Flexbox gets its name. And so when you're working with different flex items, this is kind of an example of, it's just a flex container with 10 flex items. And what's happening is all of these are set to flex 1. And so it gives you this extra space that it's taking over. You'll just kind of fill it, rather than just stacking as if it were like display block. Things would just kind of stack when you got to a certain point. So this gives you a way to just really interesting layouts where you can kind of like have it just fill the open space, and you don't have to worry about setting width 100% or trying to like figure out when it's going to wrap and set a certain breakpoint and then know that this one's going to change. And so it's kind of neat. And so to go back to the example we had with our navigation, this beautiful nav, all that extra spacing that comes from the justify content space between is actually kind of like, it's up for grabs, right, for our elements. And so when you're using these flex properties, what it does is telling the elements how much of the space do we want to take over, right? And so in this example, you can see for the home button, if I do flex grow 2, it's going to take up twice as much space as all the other elements in that nav. So it's not making it double the size. There's still no width on any of these elements. It's all kind of just proportionally based, but it's going to take twice as much extra space as any of those other ones and kind of push them all over. And so the cool thing about this is that you can kind of set something like this, where even if you get to a smaller breakpoint and if you don't have it wrapping, it'll still always take up twice the amount of space, even though the space has changed. And so it kind of it offers a lot of like really interesting ways to kind of use these like fluid layouts and kind of just set like, hey, I want this one always to be the most prominent and kind of take up space, but like you decide how much it is depending on what the size of the browser window is. And so I really, really like this, and I think this is kind of where Flexbox got its name, because it's flex grow. You can do flex shrink, so you want it to be smaller than the other ones. And then also the flex basis is kind of like setting that base value that it'll be. So you can do a lot of cool things with this. And I think that it kind of highlights where Flexbox really shines is with any sort of layouts where you don't need to set specific widths on things, and you kind of want the content to take control of where the elements are going to go. Cool. And then finally, my favorite of all the things that Flexbox does. So horizontal and vertical centering is amazing with Flexbox. So the hero trend of web design, I don't think it's really going anywhere, but it's been around forever. Having to do this before, I remember like trying to code like my first thing like this, and you basically had to find, there's a hack where you like found the width of that container, you did like margin negative 50%, but like left of like whatever the middle value of the thing. And it was like, what is happening? I don't know how to do this. This is crazy. Because it would change sizes depending on the browser. So it would work really great on desktop, and then you'd try and go to mobile, and it'd be like halfway off the screen. And so I think that like Flexbox being able, you can do 3 lines to do this, right? So you're just doing display flex, that whole kind of container becomes that flex item, and then justify content center, align item center, and that's it. So you have it centered along the cross axis and the main axis, and it'll work no matter how big the browser size is, and it's seriously like magic, and I think it's like one of the best things that's ever happened. You can use it for smaller things too. You can use it for, you know, just centering text in a shape or whatever, but I think the hero image is like a really like nice example because it's so frequently used, right? And if you wanted this to then be like left aligned when you're on a different like browser size, all you have to do is change the justify content to work with whatever you want it to be, the flex start, the flex end. And so there's a lot of cool use cases here. Cool. Okay, so just to kind of recap, Flexbox, you're using elements along a row or a column. You can change the source order. You can distribute the space in a lot of different ways. And also there's horizontal and vertical centering, which is a miracle. And so some of the examples that are using Flexbox today, this is actually my own site, so shout out to me. This is just my portfolio site, and I kind of had, it's really interesting because now that CSS Grid is coming out, I'm thinking like I might just like redo this in Grid just to see what happens. But I set all this up with Flexbox, and it's really great because it's a responsive page, and all these elements are kind of laid out nicely. I have, you know, a line self, so this is centered where all the other ones aren't. So there's a lot of different ways that you can kind of like make these cool grid layouts and then know that they're going to be responsive. This is another example of just kind of like the card layouts are really nice for Flexbox because you can kind of set at a column level for your images to always be at the top and then your buttons to always be at the bottom, and then that space in between is going to really vary depending on whatever the content is in that specific card. And so that's a really great example of a component that's Flexbox. At the same time, a nested Flexbox example is that this column layout can also be achieved, or this masonry grid layout can also be achieved with Flexbox by using kind of like a column with a wrap. So there's a lot of interesting ways to do this. And I thought this one was really neat too. So kind of creating this tournament. So all of these are sections of these little lines here can be distributed basically space between, justify content space between in a column view. And so it makes this really interesting thing where depending on if you have 3 items or 2 or 5, it's going to like set it up really nicely for you to do. So that's pretty cool. And there's a lot of examples online of different ones. And you can also just use it normally for just like aligning items next to each other. So it doesn't even have to be these like really advanced, fancy layouts. So that's just something to note. Okay, so moving into CSS Grid. There's a lot to cover here, so I'm just going to keep this very high level. But CSS Grid kind of answers the problem that Flexbox has, which is just only being able to really work along a single axis. So Grid is actually like a really 2-dimensional version, layout mode. And so you can do column-based and row-based positioning, which is like really great. And so this looks a little crazy, but this is kind of the terminology that comes with using CSS Grid. And so at the parent level, which is all the black dotted lines, you're basically setting up a template for your items to work with. So your grid container is virtually just like, here's a grid, and I'm just going to set it up. And then all of these colored spaces are actually the grid items. And so you can basically, it's almost like, you know, you have like a refrigerator and a bunch of like magnets, and you can just stick them where you want them to go, and they can overlap and change positions, things like that. But all of the grid and the template is set at the parent level, which is really nice and gives you a lot of control over how you want that to go. So just some of the different terminology. So our rows and our columns are also known as grid tracks. And then we have kind of like a grid cell. So that's just taking up one cell. And the other version of that is the grid area, and so that can take up multiple cells and span across multiple lines. And the lines here are really important because it's different from kind of like bootstrap grids per se, where you're kind of just saying like, oh, span 2 columns. you're basically picking where your items go based on the lines. So it's almost like coordinates on a map. But it's a really powerful way to do this because you can set these grids up and then have your items kind of span over multiple lines, kind of overlap each other, and it doesn't affect the grid. It's always there and it can stay there. So here's some of the properties, just a few. So grid is kind of like another one where all the properties kind of sound the same and there's just a bunch of different versions. There's also a lot of shorthand for these. But so at the grid container, you have all these different options. So you can set the columns, set the rows, set your areas up, define your grid gap, which is kind of like a margin for the lines, which is amazing. And then you can see at this like second part here, the justify items, align content, like those are all the same as Flexbox, right? But you're just working in kind of this like tract-based alignment, right? So you can say, how will these elements, be spaced out along this track or in this cell? And so you can align it to the top of the cell, to the bottom. And so it's really kind of interesting that like they're kind of keeping that terminology the same. So it's like where we're kind of going with this. And so on the other side, the grid items, these are specifically to set where this is going to go on the grid. So where template columns and template rows are setting up your template, the grid items, grid column, grid row is where you're actually like saying this is where these elements are going to be placed. And note, I just want to say down here, float, display inline block, display table cell, vertical line, none of those work on grid items, and I think for a good reason. And it just kind of like lets you know that like these aren't kind of meant to work together with them. It's kind of its own thing, and it's because you can kind of place it anywhere, and it really works really well. Okay, so let's kind of look at some examples of how to use these. So unlike Flexbox, this is controlling elements along rows and columns. And so if you wanted to create sort of a layout like this, so my grid container is now my gray box, and these are my grid items in the numbered blocks. And so this might be, with other layout modes, you can kind of, I have to set some widths, I have to set some heights, kind of figure it out. If you're using Flexbox, you might have that first item be like flex grow, kind of thing like that. But then really being able to set this up with grid is super simple and gives you kind of the most control over those elements. And so what we're looking at here, so this overlay, it's a little hard to see, but the dev tools in Chrome are really great for inspecting grid code. So it actually is going to draw out these, like, you can basically see that from before. These dotted lines are those grid lines from the previous thing. And so it shows you, like, right here we have 4 columns and 2 rows. And that's it. Like, this is kind of invisible, right? But the grid items are what are actually showing up in those spaces and kind of making the containers themselves. And so the terminology here is like kind of weird. I like to use the shorthands, but there's obviously a lot longer ways to write all these, but the repeat is really nice. And so what you're saying is, I want 4 columns that my items could live in potentially. I want each of them to be 1 fraction of the space. So FR is kind of a new thing that Grid introduced. And it's similar to saying like, width 25% or something like that. But if you ever wanted to add them, you don't have to recalculate then. Okay, now I have 5 columns. What would that be in width percentages? So it's kind of nice in that sense. It just says take 1 fraction, go for it. And then so for our template rows, we're just repeating 2, and I just set like a height here so you can kind of see that you can add pixels. And so with your grid gap, you have 10 pixels, and that's to the spacing here so you can see it. And so what is actually the fun part, right? So that template's there. It's always going to be there. But if you don't have any items in it, you're like, nothing's going to happen. The magic is like when you add the items, right? So we have 7 items in here. And on my first box, all I'm doing is saying with my grid column, I want you to go from the first line to the 3rd line. And it just fills that space. And then grid row is auto, so it'll just be the 1 cell. And so it's really kind of a line-based layout. And so that's really great because you can kind of adjust the cells to wherever they need to go. So to take another look at what we can do with this is occupying the same space and overlapping elements. So this is something we can do with grid that is really would be kind of really interesting to try with the other layout modes. I can imagine some sort of like absolute positioning sort of situation happening, you know. But with grid, so this is the same exact grid code that I used in the previous example. Nothing's changed, right? It's still 4 columns, it's still 2 rows, and that's how that works. You know, and the thing that's changing is you're actually able to take your grid items now and just move them around the grid, right? So you basically have a framework in place, but you can kind of do whatever you want with it on the grid item level. So for this example, in our first one, it's going from the first line to the third line, so it'll fill 2 tracks. And grid row 1, so it's just the 1 row. And our second one, 2 to 4, so that's the second line to the 4th line. And then grid row would be from the first line at the top, then to span the last line. So that's kind of like a short code for being able to say, just take it to the end, wherever it goes. And then so the third one, yeah, we can start the same thing. We start the row at the second row, span it to the last line, and do from 3 to 5. And so, oops. So if you're looking back here, you can see like those lines are kind of the gaps that are filling here, with the first one being the first one, the second gap being the second one. And so it's really interesting. You're using the same template, and I think that's what's cool about it is because you can take these kind of grid template and make them into modules and use those across a page, but then you can kind of choose your own adventure of how you want your items to display. And the overlapping is really nice too, and can lead to like some really cool creative layouts.
So your span last line,
yeah.
You replace that with the number 3 in this example? 3 lines?
So it would go to, oh yes, so it would be 3, yeah, 1, 3. But the way this works is if you don't always have a set number of rows, right, you wouldn't know. Right. And so what it lets you do is kind of say, just take it to wherever the edge, take it to the edge. That's where it would go, yeah. And so having the lines and having like to count can be kind of annoying, and it might seem like this is like a little bit much. So there's a really cool way to do this, which is defining template areas. And so this kind of works similarly, but like you can actually do naming with the lines. So you could have your first line be called like first line. And so you can kind of name them as you go. So it doesn't always have to be 1 to 3. It could be like first line to sidebar end line, however you want to do that. But it gets a little complex, and it can be like a lot of stuff to think about. So these template areas are really neat. And so this is an example actually from the grid spec. And so you can kind of imagine this being like a full page layout, right? So it's still the 4 columns, right? And now it's 3 rows instead of the 2 we saw before. And you can kind of say like, okay, well, I know I want this top thing to be a header. I'm going to have a main, maybe a blank space, a sidebar, and a footer. And so what that looks like from the parent level is really interesting. So you're still setting your columns and rows, but this template area is where it gets kind of neat. So you can kind of like name your sections. And it's a very literal like, okay, for my first column, or my first 4 columns on my first row, it's going to be header, 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 header. And that's like 4 columns of header. And then you have 2 mains. The dot is actually just like an empty, kind of like a spacer cell. And then you have a sidebar, right? And so the footer is going to be the full footer. And it's very like literal of like, this is how we're going to do it and how we're going to name it. And that gives you this same effect. So you have the first 4 columns being the header, the second 2 main, an empty, a sidebar, and the last 4 being a footer. And so what that actually looks like when you apply it to the grid items, which is where this is actually happening, is that you have your first box is the grid area. And so you just have to say grid area header. And now your first, whatever that div or element is, it's just going to take up that full header space. So it's just going to naturally fill that, and you don't have to worry about setting like, oh, I want it to go from the first line to the last line. It just fills the space that's already kind of been templated out for you. And same thing with the other ones. So you have your main, you have your spacer cell, and then you have a sidebar, as well as your footer. And so this is really great because you have a full page template, and you just have to kind of assign where things go. And so it'll work really well. You can set your different alignments for inside of it, your justify contents, your align items to kind of position the elements like inside of the actual track. But these are kind of like defined for you, and so you don't have to worry about anything kind of like shifting around or anything like that. It's a grid. It's stuck in the grid. So cool. So these are kind of like the top 3 really cool and exciting things. There's a ton of stuff. I really encourage you guys to all read the spec because there's so many examples and cool things that it's doing. But kind of the main takeaway here is like setting that template and being able to position your items across rows and columns in a really just smart, responsive, modern way. And so here are some examples that I pulled from gridexamples.com, which is a great site if you're looking for some inspiration. And so you can kind of see that, and this is kind of normal, and I do want to point out, with CSS Grid, you can just do normal grid layouts, right? Like the ones I was showing before with Flexbox, you can just do these normal layouts using grid. It doesn't always have to be these like advanced, overlapping, crazy layouts, but it really just makes it easier to do something like this. And you can kind of define this and put like, your contents there, your content sections are defined, and then you fill it with the grid items. This is actually really cool, and it's a lot more creative, and definitely something that little, avant-garde, but it's something where you can kind of see the different areas that the grid items are filling. But this is actually, there's just a certain amount of columns and rows that are set here. And so as you can take your items and throw them anywhere you want on the page, it really gives it a more like fluid experience, and it doesn't really have to be tied into that like traditional grid column and row layout, which is really neat. And this is like kind of another one where it's sort of like breaking the grid here. So you can kind of see that purple shape is like coming down, but there could be like multiple rows here. It doesn't really matter the amount. It's just like where you want your items to go. And so it's kind of neat that you can start to see there's like a lighter one where it's like an overlap of the image, or kind of like creating this like image shadow behind it. And so you can do some cool effects like that are just kind of subtle, but also it's like a really clean page layout without being like overly crazy. Okay, cool. So these are all really great, but can we actually support these with the browsers? The answer is yes. So surprisingly, Flexbox is pretty much green across the board, minus IE 11. I'm sorry if you guys still have to do support for IE 11 at your work. But yeah, this has been a few years coming, but it's actually in a really, really good spot right now with support. And same with Grid. And it was funny because in the keynote this morning, there was the topic of browser support and how long it takes to get browser support. Well, it was really interesting because with Grid, I think it was like March of last year, 2017, all the major browsers came out at once and basically said, we're supporting this. And it was like the first time ever that like all the browsers kind of like got on board together, except for Opera Mini. So not all of them, I'll say, but the most of the major ones, it is very much supported. Cool. Okay, and so hopefully this has been really enlightening for everyone, and you're really pumped to learn more about it. So just a couple of things here. There's a ton of resources online. These are some of the people that I follow, and they have some courses. They have some different, examples, tutorial sites, things like that. And also for reading materials, the specs are actually like a really enjoyable read. And I'm really surprised to be saying that, sitting up here saying that, but like it's a really, they're very nice. They have a lot of examples, and I think that they really, explain it all the very, very minute details if you really, really want to have like a great understanding of it. And also CSS Tricks has 2 really great guides, and they kind of break it down by container and item to kind of show you what each of the different property does, all the different options. There's a ton I didn't cover, but that's all there. Okay, cool. I did it. 2:09, 1 minute to spare. Great. Thank you, guys.